Honestly, what is a Navy nurse even doing this far forward? Go file some paperwork, ma'am, before you get a paper cut. The laughter from the assembled SEALs was sharp and dismissive, echoing off the sun-baked HESCO barriers of the remote forward operating base. They were lions in their prime, apex predators in their natural habitat, and their mockery was a casual display of dominance. But Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Reed, the subject of their derision, offered no reaction. Her face, framed by a severe knot of brown hair, remained a placid mask of professional calm. She simply continued her methodical inventory of a medical pack, her hands moving with an economy and grace that seemed alien in the chaotic, dust-choked environment. Her silence was a void, and the laughter died in it, leaving an awkward tension in its wake. The men of SEAL Team 5 saw a middle-aged officer, a non-combatant, a support asset who was out of her depth. But Captain Thorne, the base commander observing from the shade of the Tactical Operations Center, saw something else entirely. He saw the way her eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning the ridgeline that loomed over the valley, not with the nervous energy of a tourist, but with the patient, analytical gaze of a surveyor. He saw the way she stood, her weight perfectly balanced, a subtle posture of readiness that decades of command had taught him to recognize. He saw a professional, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that these young lions had just made a terrible, terrible mistake. If you believe that true strength is measured in silence and proven in action, type competence in the comments below. The arid wind that swept through FOB Vigilance was a constant, abrasive presence, carrying with it the fine, talcum-like dust of a land that had known nothing but conflict for generations. It was a wind that tested resolve, that found its way into every mechanism, every lung, every carefully laid plan. For the men of SEAL Team 5, it was just part of the atmosphere, the background noise to a life of high-stakes readiness. Their world was one of controlled violence, of brash confidence forged in the crucible of BUD/S and tempered in the fires of a dozen unnamed hellholes across the globe. They were the tip of the spear, and they carried themselves with the unshakable certainty that came with that title. Petty Officer First Class Jax Jensen was the embodiment of this ethos. He was young, strong, and exceptionally skilled with the tools of his trade. He moved with a coiled energy, a swagger that was part performance, part genuine belief in his own invincibility. His humor was a weapon, used to establish hierarchy, to test newcomers, to enforce the unwritten codes of their warrior tribe. When Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Reed had arrived 2 weeks prior, a transfer from a cushy hospital post in Germany, Jax had immediately categorized her. She was an outsider, a POG, in the parlance of the infantryman, a support staffer who existed to serve the needs of the real warriors. Her quiet demeanor, her refusal to engage in their boisterous banter, her methodical, almost serene way of organizing the base clinic. He interpreted it all as weakness, as the timid uncertainty of someone who did not belong. His comment hadn't been born of true malice, but of a deep-seated, arrogant assumption. In his world, value was demonstrated through noise, through action, through the confident proclamation of one's own abilities. Silence was invisibility. Silence was irrelevance. He saw her crisp, clean uniform and saw a rear echelon administrator. He saw her rank and saw a career of bureaucratic box ticking. He did not see, could not see, the universe of disciplined violence that lay dormant behind her calm, gray eyes. Reed, for her part, was an expert in observation. Her entire life, in one form or another, had been about watching, waiting, and understanding the environment. She understood the social dynamics of the SEAL team perfectly. She saw Jax not as an antagonist, but as a variable, a loud, predictable element in a complex system. His insults were like the wind, annoying, persistent, but ultimately irrelevant to the task at hand. Her focus was absolute. As she counted sutures, checked morphine ampoules, and cataloged chest seals, her mind was a silent whirlwind of calculations. She noted the placement of the guard towers, the predictable patrol routes of the base security detail, the natural fields of fire offered by the surrounding terrain. She observed the shimmer of heat haze on the distant ridgeline, noting how it distorted shapes, how it could deceive the eye. She saw the nesting patterns of the local birds, knowing their sudden flight could signal the approach of an unseen threat. While the seal saw a nurse, she was performing a constant, subconscious threat assessment, a habit etched into her very soul by a different kind of training in a different uniform a lifetime ago. Her hands, which Jax and his teammates saw as soft and uncalloused, were instruments of incredible precision. They could insert an .4 into a rolling Humvee or field strip a weapon system in total darkness. The steadiness of those hands was not the product of a calm life, but the result of mastering chaos, of learning to impose an iron will upon the body's natural tremors of fear and adrenaline. Captain Thorne watched her from afar, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. He had seen operators like Jax before, talented, brave, but dangerously blind to their own assumptions. It was an institutional flaw, a byproduct of creating such an elite and insular force. They believed so fiercely in their own exceptionalism that they often failed to recognize it in others, especially when it came in an unexpected package. He saw Reed finish her inventory, close the pack with a satisfying click, and place it neatly on a shelf. She turned, and her eyes briefly met his across the dusty expanse of the compound. There was no emotion in her gaze, no plea for help, no hint of anger. It was a look of pure, unadulterated professionalism. And in that moment, Thorne felt a premonition, a cold certainty that the universe was about to provide a very harsh, very memorable lesson on the dangers of underestimation. The wind picked up, swirling dust devils across the parade ground, and the air grew heavy with a tension that had nothing to do with the weather. The lesson arrived not with a whisper, but with a deafening crack that was utterly distinct from the familiar report of an AK-47. It was a sound that split the air, a high-velocity, supersonic whip that signified a purpose-built tool of death in the hands of skilled marksmen. The bullet impacted the sandbags atop the central guard tower with a violent explosion of dust and fabric, a full 2 seconds before the sound of the shot reached them. Every SEAL on the compound reacted instantly, their bodies moving with the fluid instinct of years of training. Laughter and arrogance vanished, replaced by a cold, focused intensity. They flowed into positions of cover, their weapons up, their eyes scanning the terrain for which the attack had come. Jax was already on his comms, his voice stripped of all its earlier swagger, now a clipped professional bark. Contact. Single sniper. Unknown position. East Ridge. Another crack echoed through the valley, and this time it found a target. Sergeant Miller, the team's own designated marksman, who had been moving towards his M210 sniper rifle, cried out and collapsed, clutching a shattered femur. The round had been perfectly placed, not a kill shot, but a deliberate, tactical disabling of the team's primary counter-sniper asset. Panic, a word not often associated with SEAL Team 5, began to slither at the edges of their discipline. This wasn't a random potshot from a local insurgent. This was a professional. The enemy was patient, hidden, and in complete control of the engagement. The distance was extreme, easily over 1,000 meters, a shot that required immense skill and a superior weapon system. The SEALs were pinned, unable to effectively return fire or even locate the shooter's hide. Every time a helmet peeked over a barrier, another round would tear the air apart, forcing them back down. They were being systematically dismantled by an invisible enemy. In the midst of this controlled chaos, a new kind of movement began. It was not the explosive, aggressive motion of the SEALs, but something quieter, more deliberate. Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Reed moved from the relative safety of the clinic's reinforced walls out into the open. She did not run. She moved in a low crouch, flowing from one piece of cover to the next with a liquid grace that defied her rank and perceived role. Her path was not random. It was a perfectly calculated route that minimized her exposure, a lethal ballet danced between moments of incoming fire. Jack saw her and screamed into his radio, "Ma'am, get back inside." "That's an order." She did not acknowledge him. Her focus was singular, her destination clear. The spot where Sergeant Miller lay, his advanced sniper rifle lying in the dust just beyond his reach. She reached the wounded man, her movements betraying no hint of fear. Her hands, The same hands that had been counting bandages moments before were a blur of efficiency. She applied a tourniquet high on his leg, cinching it with practiced force, her voice low and calm. "You'll be fine, Sergeant. Just keep pressure on it." Then she turned her attention to the rifle. It was an M210, a heavily modified M14, a beautiful and deadly piece of precision engineering. To the SEALs, it was a tool. To Evelyn Reed, it was an old friend. She did not simply pick it up. She knelt, her eyes scanning its every detail. She checked the optic, the state of the action, the seating of the magazine. Her hands moved with a familiarity that was both shocking and deeply unnerving to those who watched. She settled behind the weapon, her body molding to the contours of the earth as if she were a part of it. The way she assumed the prone position was not something learned in a basic rifle course. It was a posture of perfect stability, a fusion of bone, muscle, and earth that turned the shooter into a rock-solid firing platform. She adjusted the bipod, her fingers making minute, precise changes. She placed the stock into the pocket of her shoulder, a movement as natural and ingrained as breathing. She was no longer a nurse. She was something else, something ancient and terrible. Captain Thorne watched from the TOC, his heart pounding against his ribs. He had seen it. In that fluid, perfect motion of settling behind the rifle, he saw the ghost of 1,000 training ranges, the muscle memory of a true master. He knew. He finally knew what she was. And as he watched her begin the slow, rhythmic breathing of a marksman preparing for a shot of impossible difficulty, he realized the lesson was about to be given its final, stunning exclamation point. The entire base seemed to hold its breath, the fate of the engagement now resting on the shoulders of the woman they had all so casually dismissed. The world for Evelyn Reed shrank to the circular image in her scope. The chaos of the firefight, the shouts of the SEALs, the biting wind, it all faded into a distant, muffled hum. There was only the breathing, the crosshairs, and the problem. The problem was a ghost on a ridgeline over 1,200 meters away, a ghost who was a master of his craft. He had chosen his position perfectly, a small notch in the rocks that offered maximum concealment and a commanding view of the base. He was using the heat haze to his advantage, the shimmering air breaking up his outline, making him a needle in a continental haystack. But Reed was not looking for a man. She was looking for disturbances, for things that were out of place. She wasn't scanning the rocks. She was reading the light. She was watching the way the wind moved the sparse, hardy bushes, looking for a patch of stillness where there should be motion. She was observing the subtle play of shadow and sun, searching for a shadow that was too deep, too geometric. Her mind, a biological supercomputer honed by a decade of this exact work, began to process the variables. The wind was gusting from her left to right, inconsistent, a sniper's nightmare. She watched the dust kick up, judging its speed. 10, maybe 12 miles per hour. She factored in the spin drift of the 762 millimeters round, the subtle pull of the Earth's rotation over that extreme distance. She calculated the upward angle to the ridge, the air density at their altitude. Numbers, angles, and formulas flowed through her mind not as a conscious effort, but as pure, ingrained instinct. She had become a math. Jax and the others watched, dumbfounded through their own optics. They saw nothing. The ridgeline was a jumble of rock and shadow, an impenetrable wall of nature. They couldn't comprehend what she was even aiming at. To them, she was pointing a rifle at a mountain. "What is she doing?" one of the younger SEALs whispered over the comms. "There's nothing there," Jax didn't answer. He was transfixed by the sheer, unadulterated calm she projected. Her trigger finger was straight, resting on the frame of the weapon, not the trigger itself. Her left hand was a cradle for the stock, her thumb barely touching, not squeezing. Her cheek was welded to the stock, her eye perfectly aligned with the scope. It was a flawless textbook application of the fundamentals, a level of discipline he had only ever seen in the most senior instructors at sniper school. Then he saw her exhale. It was a long, slow, controlled breath, emptying her lungs completely. In the momentary pause that followed, the space between heartbeats where the human body is at its most still, her finger moved. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a controlled, powerful recoil that she absorbed effortlessly. The sound of the shot was a sharp, clean bark, a statement of intent. For a moment, nothing happened. The wind continued to blow. The ridgeline remained unchanged. The younger SEAL started to speak again, a note of disappointment in his voice, but Jax cut him off. Wait! He had his high-power binoculars trained on the area Reed had been aiming at. He saw it first. A tiny puff of dust, impossibly small at this distance, kicked up from the rocks a few feet to the left of a dark crevice. A miss. A clean miss. But Reed didn't move. She didn't curse. She didn't even blink. She had already cycled the bolt on the rifle. The motion so smooth and practiced, it was almost silent, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a new round. She hadn't fired a killing shot. She had fired a ranging shot. She had sent a messenger downrange to get the exact windage, to see how the unpredictable gusts in the valley were affecting the bullet's flight path. The puff of dust was her answer. Now she knew. Now she had the solution to the problem. She adjusted the windage knob on her scope. 2 clicks to the right. A tiny, almost imperceptible movement. She settled back into her perfect stillness, her breathing once again falling into that slow, hypnotic rhythm. She exhaled, and in the stillness, she fired again. This time, the result was different. There was no puff of dust from the rocks. For a long, agonizing second, there was nothing at all. The silence stretched, taut, and electric. The invisible enemy on the ridge did not return fire. The oppressive threat that had pinned down an entire platoon of America's most elite warriors had simply vanished. The silence that followed was more profound, more deafening than the crack of the rifle itself. It was a silence filled with disbelief, with questions, with a dawning, earth-shattering awe. Jax, his binoculars still pressed to his eyes, was the first to break it. His voice over the radio was a strangled whisper, stripped of all authority, all arrogance, all certainty. Target down. I saw him. He just slumped. He lowered the binoculars, his face a pale mask of shock. He looked from the impossibly distant ridgeline back to the woman lying prone in the dust. She was no longer looking through the scope. She had already detached herself from the weapon, her focus shifting. Her first action was to crawl back to the wounded Sergeant Miller, her hands immediately going to check his tourniquet, her voice once again the calm, reassuring tone of a medical professional. The bleeding has stopped. We need to get you to the clinic. It was as if the last 2 minutes had never happened. As if she hadn't just performed a feat of marksmanship that would become the stuff of legend. The other SEALs slowly, hesitantly, began to emerge from cover. They moved like men waking from a dream, their eyes fixed on Reed. They saw her gently stabilizing Miller's leg, her movements careful and tender. They looked at the M210 rifle lying beside her, a simple object of wood and steel that, in her hands, had become an instrument of divine judgment. The contrast was too much to process. The gentle caregiver and the lethal hunter resided in the same body, a paradox that shattered their neatly ordered world. The spell was broken by the arrival of Captain Thorne. He strode out from the TOC, his face grim and determined. He didn't look at Jax or the other operators. His eyes were locked on Lieutenant Commander Reed. He walked past the rifle, past the stunned onlookers, and knelt beside her and the wounded SEAL. "Report, Commander," he said, his voice level and formal, but laced with an undercurrent of profound respect. Reed looked up from her patient, her gray eyes meeting his. "Enemy sniper neutralized, Captain. Sergeant Miller has a gunshot wound to the right femur, non-arterial. He's stable, but he needs immediate evacuation to a level 3 trauma center." Her report was clinical, precise, and devoid of any self-congratulation. She had stated the facts, just as she would report a patient's temperature. There was no hint of pride, no acknowledgement of the miracle she had just performed. She had simply identified a problem, a tactical problem, and she had solved it, just as she was now solving a medical one. Thorne nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the rifle, then back to her. The questions were hanging in the air, thick and heavy. "Who are you? Where did you come from? How did you do that?" But he didn't ask them. Not yet. He stood up and keyed his radio. "TOC, this is Vigilance 6. Send the medical team. And give me Lieutenant Commander Reed's full service record. Now." His voice brooked no argument. He then turned to face the men of SEAL Team 5, his expression one of cold, simmering anger. He didn't need to see the file to know the truth. He had seen enough. The lesson was over. Now it was time for the debrief. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that it was one his men would never, ever forget. The age of assumption was over. Captain Thorne stood in the center of the dusty compound, a silent sentinel as the medical team carefully loaded Sergeant Miller onto a stretcher. The base was secure, the threat eliminated, but the atmosphere was heavier than it had been during the attack. It was the oppressive weight of shattered pride and dawning realization. The SEALs stood in a loose, uncertain cluster, their weapons held loosely, their usual swagger completely gone. They avoided looking at each other, but their eyes kept flicking towards the woman who was now calmly directing the medics. Her authority in the medical sphere as absolute and unquestioned as her authority in the tactical one had just become. The radio on Thorne's vest crackled to life. "Vigilance 6, this is TOC. We have the file you requested, sir." It's extensive. The comms officer's voice was tinged with an uncharacteristic note of awe. "Send it to my tablet," Thorne commanded. A moment later, the screen in his hand lit up. He didn't open it immediately. He first walked over to where Jax was standing, his head bowed, his face ashen. Thorne stood before him, saying nothing, letting the silence do the work. Finally, Jax looked up, his eyes filled with a shame so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Sir, he began, but his voice failed him. "You don't get to speak right now, petty officer," Thorne said, his voice quiet but carrying the force of a thunderclap. "You get to listen. You, and every single one of you," he turned, sweeping his gaze across the entire team. "You men are the best of the best. You've been trained to be smarter, faster, and more lethal than any enemy you will ever face. But today you failed. Not tactically, not physically. You failed morally. You failed with your intellect. You allowed arrogance and prejudice to blind you to the reality standing right in front of you." He held up the tablet, his thumb hovering over the file icon. "You looked at a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, and you saw a clerk. You saw a liability. You judged her by her rank, by her gender, by her quiet demeanor. You saw everything except the truth." He tapped the screen. The file opened, and he began to read, his voice ringing out across the silent compound, each word a hammer blow to the foundations of their arrogance. "Name, Evelyn Reed. Current rank, Lieutenant Commander, Nurse Corps, United States Navy." He paused, letting the first irony sink in. "Previous service branch, United States Marine Corps." A murmur went through the crowd. This was unexpected but not unheard of. "Previous rank." Thorne paused again, his eyes finding Reed's across the compound. She gave a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a silent plea to let it go. But Thorne ignored it. This lesson needed to be loud. It needed to be permanent. "Previous rank, Gunnery Sergeant." The SEALs stiffened. A gunny, a senior enlisted Marine NCO. That alone commanded a different level of respect. It implied a career spent not behind a desk, but in the mud and the blood. Military occupational specialty, 8541. Scout sniper. The silence was now absolute. The world seemed to stop spinning. Jax felt the blood drain from his face. A Marine Scout sniper. Not just a shooter, but a member of one of the most famously difficult, intellectually demanding, and lethally effective schools in the entire United States military. They were legends, known as much for their fieldcraft and intelligence gathering as for their marksmanship. They were called hogs, hunters of gunmen. Thorne wasn't finished. He continued, his voice like a judge reading a verdict. "Schools, Scout Sniper Basic Course, Marine Corps Base Quantico, Honor Graduate. High-Angle Marksmanship School, Distinguished Honor Graduate. Special Operations Target Interdiction Course. Top Shot Award." He swiped the screen. "Deployments. Operation Enduring Freedom, 4 tours. Operation Iraqi Freedom, 3 tours. He looked up from the tablet, his eyes burning with a cold fire. Her operational file from her time in the Corps is heavily redacted. But what isn't redacted are the commendations. A Bronze Star with V for Valor. Another Bronze Star. A Purple Heart. A Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with V for Valor. He lowered the tablet, the weight of those words settling over the men. They had mocked a decorated combat veteran, a legend in a community they barely understood. They had told one of the most accomplished marksmen of her generation to go file paperwork. The sheer, monumental ignorance of their actions was crushing. The truth was out, a blinding light that incinerated their petty prejudices and left them exposed and ashamed. The mystery of the quiet nurse was solved, replaced by a reality that was far more potent, far more intimidating than any of them could have possibly imagined. Captain Thorne let the weight of the revelation settle, allowing the SEALs to stew in the acid of their own misjudgment. He then walked purposefully across the compound, his boots crunching in the gravel, every step a declaration. He stopped directly in front of Lieutenant Commander Reed, who had just finished briefing the pilot of the medevac helicopter. The rotors were beginning to spin, whipping up a storm of dust and noise. But in the space between the two officers, there was a pocket of profound stillness. The men of SEAL Team 5 watched, unable to look away. This was the final act of the drama, the moment of official validation. Thorne, a man known for his stoicism, a captain in the United States Navy who commanded the respect of the entire Special Operations community, looked at Reed. His eyes, which had been filled with anger when addressing his men, now held a look of deep, undisguised admiration. He saw past the Nurse Corps insignia on her collar, past the silver oak leaf of her current rank. He saw the gunnery sergeant. He saw the hunter of gunmen. He saw the quiet professional who had saved his men from their own predicament and, more importantly, from their own arrogance. Then he did something that none of the SEALs had ever seen him do for an officer of her rank. He snapped to attention, his back ramrod straight. He raised his hand in a salute so sharp, so precise, it could have cut glass. It was not the casual salute exchanged between officers. It was the formal, profound gesture of respect reserved for a Medal of Honor recipient or a visiting general. It was a salute that acknowledged not rank, but worth. "Gunnery Sergeant Reed," he said, his voice clear and strong, deliberately using her former rank. Then he corrected himself, the formality of the moment demanding it. "Commander, your actions today were in the finest tradition of the United States Naval Service. You saved lives. You have my and this entire base's deepest gratitude." Evelyn Reed looked taken aback for the first time that day. A flicker of emotion, surprise, perhaps discomfort at the attention, crossed her features before being replaced by her customary composure. She returned the salute, her own gesture equally crisp. "Just doing my job, Captain," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "My patient is secure. That was my priority." The simplicity of her statement was more powerful than any boast. She didn't acknowledge the shot. She didn't speak of her past. She defined her actions by her current duty, to care for the wounded. She was a nurse. That was her job. The fact that eliminating a hostile sniper at 1,200 meters was a necessary step in performing that job was, to her, merely a procedural detail. Thorne held the salute for a moment longer before dropping his hand. He turned to Jax, who had approached hesitantly, his face a mess of conflicting emotions. "Petty Officer Jensen," Thorne said, his voice softening slightly, but still firm. "You have something to say to the commander." Jax swallowed hard, his eyes finally meeting Reed's. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, humbling clarity. "Mom, Commander," he stammered, "there's no excuse for my behavior. What I said, what I thought, was unprofessional and ignorant. I was wrong, completely. What you did today, I've never seen anything like it. Thank you. And I am sorry." The apology was not loud or performative. It was quiet, sincere, and deeply felt. It was the sound of a man's ego breaking, and in its place, something better, respect, being born. Reed simply looked at him, her gray eyes analytical as always. She gave a single, small nod. "Apology accepted, petty officer. Now check on your men. See who needs water." It was a dismissal and an order delivered with the quiet authority of a senior NCO who knows how to manage troops. She had accepted his apology, but had also immediately put him back to work, reminding him of his duty. The lesson was complete. The validation was public. The quiet professional had not needed to say a word in her own defense. Her competence had spoken for her, and its voice was an undeniable roar that had shaken the foundations of an entire SEAL team. As the medevac helicopter lifted off, carrying Sergeant Miller to safety, a new reality began to settle over FOB vigilance. The quiet nurse was not who they thought she was. She was infinitely more. The story of what happened at FOB Vigilance did not spread. It detonated. It traveled through the encrypted channels of the special operations community, whispered in hushed tones in chow halls from Afghanistan to Djibouti, and became an instant legend retold in the team rooms at Dam Neck and Coronado. The narrative was honed with each retelling, acquiring the burnished patina of folklore. It was the story of Doc Ghost, the quiet Navy nurse who was secretly a legendary Marine gunny. It was a cautionary tale, a parable about the dangers of assumption. For the men of SEAL Team 5, it was not a story. It was a memory seared into their collective consciousness. The change was not immediate, but it was profound. The casual arrogance, the chest-thumping bravado, was tempered by a new, more thoughtful sense of professionalism. The laughter in the team room became less about mockery and more about camaraderie. A new, unwritten rule emerged. You never, ever judge a book by its cover, especially not on a forward operating base. Jax Jensen was the most visibly changed. The incident had cracked his pride, but it had not broken his spirit. Instead, it had reforged him. He became quieter, more observant. He started to listen more than he spoke. He saw leadership not as the projection of dominance, but as the quiet cultivation of competence, both in himself and in his men. He would often seek out Lieutenant Commander Reed, not to talk about shooting, but to talk about mindset. He would find her in the clinic, meticulously cleaning her instruments, and he would ask her questions. "How do you stay so calm, ma'am?" he asked one day. Reed paused her work, looking at him with her steady gaze. "You don't fight the chaos," she said simply. "You accept it. You find a point of stillness inside it, and you operate from there. Your pulse, your breathing. That's the only part of the battlefield you can truly control. Control that, and you can control everything else." Her mentorship was never about her past. She never spoke of the Marine Corps, never told war stories. Her lessons were in the here and now, taught through her unwavering example of discipline, focus, and dedication to her duty. She was teaching them the philosophy of the quiet professional, not with lectures, but by living it every single day. The physical evidence of her deed became a shrine. A young SEAL, on a patrol of the Ridgeline days later, found the enemy sniper's position. He also found the 762 millimeters round that had ended the fight. It was a perfect textbook kill. He brought the projectile back to the base. It was cleaned, polished, and mounted on a simple wooden plaque next to the spent casing from Reed's rifle, which another operator had found at her firing position. The plaque was hung in the TOC, right next to the tactical maps. It bore a simple inscription, FOB Vigilance. The dangers of assumption. Every person who entered the command center saw it. It was a permanent reminder. The spot where she had taken a shot, a small patch of dusty ground between a row of sandbags and a concrete barrier, was given a name. The SEAL started calling it Reed's Perch. It became a point of reverence. New operators arriving at the base would be taken there, and one of the veterans of Team 5, often Jack himself, would tell them the story. He would tell them about the arrogant assumptions they had made, about the impossible shot, and about the quiet, unassuming nurse who had taught them the true meaning of the word professional. The legend grew, but the woman at its center remained unchanged. She continued her work in the clinic, treating injuries, managing supplies, and caring for her patients with a quiet, relentless competence. She had not sought validation or fame. She had not needed it. Her worth was not defined by the opinions of others, but by the standards she set for herself. And in doing so, she had transformed the culture of an entire elite unit, proving that the most powerful weapon in any arsenal is not a rifle, but a disciplined mind and a humble spirit. The ripples of that day continued to spread, creating a legacy that extended far beyond the wire of FOB Vigilance. Months turned into a year. Personnel rotated in and out. New faces replaced the old. But the story of Doc Ghost endured. It became part of the institutional memory of the base, a foundational myth passed down from one team to the next. It was used by senior NCOs and officers as a training tool, a perfect, real-world example of why prejudice and ego are tactical liabilities. A new SEAL arriving at the FOB would be given the standard tour. Here's the chow hall, here's the armory, here's the gym, and here is Reed's perch. The story would be told, always with a tone of reverence, always with the same moral. Look around you. A seasoned Master Chief would tell the new arrivals. See the cooks, the mechanics, the intel analysts, the medics. They're not your servants. They are part of this team, and any one of them might be the one to save your life one day. Never assume you're the most dangerous person in the room. That was her true legacy. Not the single, incredible shot, but the enduring lesson it taught. It was a legacy of respect. Jax Jensen eventually made Chief Petty Officer. His leadership style was noted for its quiet confidence, its emphasis on teamwork, and its absolute intolerance for arrogance. He mentored his young SEALs relentlessly, not just in the arts of war, but in the art of being a humble warrior. He often quoted the woman who had so profoundly changed his life's trajectory, telling his men to find the stillness in the chaos of combat. He made sure every operator who served under him knew that competence came in all shapes, sizes, and uniforms. He made sure the lesson of that day was never forgotten. Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Reed eventually finished her tour at FOB Vigilance. On her last day, the entire base seemed to turn out to see her off. There was no formal ceremony at her request, but as she walked toward the C-130 that would begin her journey home, she passed a formation of SEALs. Every single one of them, from the newest operator to Captain Thorne himself, stood at attention and rendered a slow, perfect salute. Jax was at the front. As she passed, he simply said, "Thank you, ma'am." For everything. Reed paused and looked at the men, these elite warriors who now regarded her with something approaching worship. She gave them a small, rare smile and a single nod, the same nod of acknowledgement she had given Jax after his apology. That was all that was needed. She boarded the plane, and as it taxied down the runway, she looked out the small porthole window. She saw the dusty compound, the guard towers, the distant, silent ridgeline. It was just one more place in a long line of dusty, dangerous places she had served. She had done her job. She had cared for her people. She had solved the problems that needed solving. Her work here was done. She closed her eyes, the roar of the engines a familiar lullaby. She had left behind more than just a memory. She had left behind a new standard, a standard of quiet competence, of mutual respect, of the unassailable truth that actions will always speak louder than words. Her legacy was not written on a plaque, but in the changed hearts and minds of the warriors she had served alongside. It was a living legacy, carried forward in the actions of those she had inspired. The story of Evelyn Reed, the quiet nurse with the soul of a warrior, became more than just a base legend. It evolved into a powerful symbol within the wider military community. It represented a fundamental truth that often gets lost in the noise of rank, reputation, and bravado. It was a testament to the idea that true professionalism is a state of being, an internal discipline that requires no external validation. It is calm in the face of chaos, precise in the grip of pressure, and silent in the presence of arrogance. It is the steady hand that performs the life-saving procedure and the steady hand that aligns the crosshairs. It is the quiet competence that waits patiently for its moment, not to seek glory, but to serve a purpose. We often make the mistake of measuring strength in decibels. We are drawn to the loudest voice in the room, the most confident proclamation, the most intimidating posture. We build hierarchies based on these superficial displays, allowing our assumptions to construct a reality that is often dangerously flawed. We create gatekeepers like Jax Jensen, who, armed with a little knowledge and a lot of pride, believe they have the right to judge the worth of others based on a uniform, a title, or a first impression. But history is filled with quiet professionals like Evelyn Reed. They are the unnoticed figures in the background, the diligent, the focused, the humble. They are the ones who master their craft in silence, who drill the fundamentals until they are as natural as breathing, who prepare relentlessly for a moment that may never come. They do not seek the spotlight. They seek only to be ready. When the moment of crisis arrives, when the carefully constructed facades of arrogance and pride are shattered by the harsh impact of reality, it is the quiet professional who steps out of the shadows. They do not rise to the occasion. They sink to the level of their training. And in that moment, their actions become their voice, a roar of competence so undeniable that it silences all doubt, shames all prejudice, and realigns the world around a new, more truthful center of gravity. Evelyn Reed's story is a reminder that the most valuable asset in any organization, be it a SEAL team or a corporate office, is the individual who puts the mission before their ego. It is a call to look beyond the surface, to challenge our own biases, and to cultivate a respect for the silent, often invisible, work that forms the bedrock of any successful enterprise. True legacy isn't what you claim, it's what you prove. It isn't found in the medals on a chest, but in the positive change you inspire in others. It is the enduring lesson, passed from one generation to the next, that the ultimate measure of a person is not the noise they make, but the difference they make when everything is on the line. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where a disciplined mind defines a warrior's worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.